Whispers echo through the stone corridors of a forgotten military outpost. Stories of men who vanished without explanation, of screams that carried through the night, of hunger that drove human beings past the edge of sanity. In 1889, a group of military guards stumbled upon a truth so disturbing that the military tried to bury it for over a century. What they found behind locked doors would change everything. They thought they knew about honor, duty, and the darkness that lives inside desperate men. But before we can understand what happened in that remote fortress, we need to go back to a time when military discipline meant something far more brutal than we can imagine today. Back to when men were sent to places so isolated that the outside world forgot they existed. The winter of 1888 was particularly harsh across the Northern Territories. Snow piled 15 feet high in some regions, cutting off supply lines for months at a time. Remote military outposts, already operating on thin resources, found themselves completely isolated. No food shipments, no communication, no relief coming until spring thaw, which could be 5, maybe 6 months away. Fort Resolution sat at the edge of the wilderness, a gray stone structure that looked more like a prison than a military installation. And in many ways, that's exactly what it was. The fort housed both active military personnel and prisoners, men who'd committed crimes serious enough to warrant removal from regular service, but not serious enough for execution. These weren't murderers or traitors. Most were deserters, thieves, men who'd cracked under the pressure of military life and made choices they couldn't take back. The guards assigned to Fort Resolution weren't the military's finest. This was punishment duty, a posting given to soldiers who'd disappointed their superiors but hadn't quite earned discharge. Young Private James Whitmore arrived at the fort in October of 1888, reassigned after a gambling incident at his previous post. He was 22 years old, still believing in the romance of military service, still thinking honor meant something. The fort's commanding officer was Captain Richard Holbrook, a veteran of multiple campaigns who'd somehow ended up in this forgotten corner of the world. Some said he'd been caught skimming supplies. Others whispered about an incident with a superior's wife. Whatever the truth, Holbrook ran Fort Resolution like his own private kingdom, and the men under his command learned quickly not to ask questions. When Whitmore first arrived, he noticed something odd about the prisoner population. The official records showed 47 inmates, but when he counted during morning formation, he only saw 39. He mentioned this to another guard, a grizzled veteran named Sergeant Thomas Burke. Burke's response was immediate and sharp. "Don't count the prisoners," he said. "Don't ask about the numbers. Do your rounds, keep your mouth shut, and you'll make it through the winter." But Whitmore couldn't let it go. 8 men don't just disappear. He started paying closer attention during his shifts. He noticed that every few weeks, a prisoner would be called to the captain's quarters. Sometimes they'd return. Sometimes they wouldn't. The ones who did come back looked different, haunted. They stopped talking to the other inmates, stopped eating in the common area, kept their eyes down and their mouths shut. One of these men was a former corporal named David Marsh, imprisoned for desertion. Whitmore had spoken with Marsh a few times, found him intelligent and articulate, someone who'd made a mistake but seemed genuinely remorseful. 3 weeks into Whitmore's posting, Marsh was summoned to the captain's quarters. He came back 6 hours later. His face was pale, his hands shaking. Whitmore tried to speak with him, but Marsh wouldn't make eye contact. He just shook his head slowly and walked to his cell. That night, Whitmore heard something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Marsh was praying. Not the kind of prayer you say before meals or at Sunday service. This was desperate, broken, the sound of a man begging God for forgiveness. The supply situation grew worse as winter deepened. The last wagon train had arrived in late October, and it had been lighter than expected. By December, rations were cut in half. By January, they were cut again. The guards ate first, then the officers, then the prisoners got whatever remained. Some days, that meant a thin gruel made from grain dust and water. Some days, it meant nothing at all. The prisoners started looking skeletal. Their uniforms hung off their frames like burial shrouds. When they moved, you could hear their joints cracking. Several died from what the camp doctor called malnutrition, though Whitmore noticed the doctor always performed these examinations alone, always signed the death certificates without allowing anyone else to view the bodies. Then the disappearances accelerated. 3 prisoners in 1 week, then 4 more the following week. Whitmore kept his own count now, marking names in a small journal he hid in his bunk. The official records never changed, still showed 47 inmates, but Whitmore's count dropped to 26. 21 men had vanished. Sergeant Burke caught him writing one night. The older man's face went hard. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. "Some things you don't want to know. Some things, once you see them, you can't unsee. Go back to your bunk. Forget about the numbers." But Whitmore couldn't forget. He started watching the captain's quarters more carefully during his night rounds. The windows were always curtained, but sometimes he'd see shadows moving inside, hear sounds he couldn't quite identify. Once, around 2 in the morning, he heard what sounded like sawing. Methodical, rhythmic. It went on for nearly an hour. The next morning, another prisoner was reported dead. Malnutrition, according to the doctor. The body was buried immediately in the frozen ground behind the fort. Whitmore noticed the grave was unusually small for a full-grown man. February brought the worst cold anyone could remember. The temperature dropped so low that water froze inside the guards' canteens, even when kept close to the fire. 3 guards died from exposure during routine patrols. The fort's population, already depleted, shrank further. Everyone was hungry now, not just the prisoners. The officers had stopped joining the guards for meals. They ate in private, in the captain's quarters, and they looked healthier than anyone else in the fort. This was when Private Marcus Chen, another guard who'd befriended Whitmore, started asking the same questions. Chen was older, mid-30s, a career soldier who'd seen combat and wasn't easily frightened. He'd noticed the same discrepancies, counted the same missing men. One night, he and Whitmore compared notes. The numbers were undeniable. By Chen's count, 23 prisoners had disappeared. By Whitmore's count, 24. They cross-referenced their lists. 24 men gone. No transfers, no releases, no official records of death for most of them. "What do you think is happening?" Chen asked. Whitmore didn't want to say it out loud, didn't want to give voice to the terrible suspicion that had been growing in his mind for weeks. But Chen was watching him, waiting for an answer. "I think," Whitmore said slowly, "that we need to see what's in the captain's quarters." They started planning. It had to be careful. If they were caught searching the commander's private rooms, they'd face court-martial at minimum, execution at worst. But they both knew they couldn't let this continue. Whatever was happening, it had to stop. The opportunity came 3 weeks later. Captain Holbrook announced that he'd be leading a supply expedition to a nearby settlement, a desperate last attempt to find food before the spring thaw. He'd take 4 officers with him and be gone for at least 5 days. The fort would be under Sergeant Burke's command during his absence. Whitmore and Chen waited until the expedition left. Then they waited another full day, watching Burke's routine, noting when he did his rounds, when he slept. On the second night, at exactly 3 in the morning, when Burke was at the far end of the fort checking the perimeter, they made their move. The captain's quarters were locked, but Chen had learned lockpicking during a misspent youth before joining the military. His hands shook as he worked the mechanism. It took 4 minutes that felt like 4 hours. Then the lock clicked open. The smell hit them first. Whitmore had been in slaughterhouses before, had seen battlefield casualties. This was different. Older, deeper, the kind of smell that gets into your clothes and your skin and never quite leaves. They lit a small lantern, keeping the light low. The front room looked normal enough. Desk, maps, military documents, nothing unusual, but there was a door at the back, a heavy wooden door with a new lock, much stronger than the one on the main entrance. Chen went to work on it. This lock took longer. His hands were sweating now, despite the cold. Finally, it gave way. They pushed the door open. The room beyond was cold, colder than the rest of the building. That's when Whitmore understood. This room had been deliberately kept at freezing temperature. It was being used as a storage space. But storage for what? They stepped inside. The lantern light fell across hooks on the walls. Large hooks, the kind used in butcher shops. And hanging from those hooks were things wrapped in cloth, things that were roughly the size and shape of... Whitmore stumbled backward. Chen caught him, but the older man's face had gone white. They both knew what they were looking at. They just didn't want to believe it. Chen moved closer, reached out with a shaking hand, and pulled back one of the cloth coverings. In the dim light, they saw frozen meat, human meat, a human leg stripped of skin, butchered like livestock. Whitmore turned and vomited. Chen just stood there staring, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were showing him. There were at least a dozen of these packages, maybe more in the shadows beyond the lantern's reach. On a table in the corner, they found butchering tools. Saws, knives, all clean, all organized. Next to the tools was a leather-bound journal. Chen opened it with numb fingers. Inside were dates, names, and descriptions. The journal of Captain Richard Holbrook, a detailed record of which prisoners had been killed, how they'd been prepared, and how the meat had been distributed among the officers. The entries were clinical, almost businesslike. December 14th, prisoner Marsh yielded approximately 95 pounds usable meat, divided among 5 officers. February 3rd, prisoner Williams, 87 pounds, shared among 4 officers. The journal went back months, all the way to November, just weeks after Whitmore had arrived. The captain had been methodically selecting prisoners, killing them, and feeding them to his officer corps, and according to the journal, every officer at the fort had participated, every single one. Chen closed the journal. "We have to tell someone," he said. His voice sounded hollow. "Tell who?" Whitmore asked. "The captain will be back in 3 days. The officers are all complicit. Sergeant Burke knows. He has to know. That's why he warned me off. Then we take this to the territorial command. We bring the journal. We bring witnesses. We..." A sound outside the door froze them both. Footsteps in the hallway. Someone was coming. They'd been in the room too long. Burke must have noticed their absence from rounds. Chen grabbed the journal and shoved it inside his coat. They extinguished the lantern and pressed themselves against the wall, waiting in the darkness. The footsteps came closer, stopped outside the door. They could hear breathing on the other side of the wood. Then Burke's voice, quiet and sad. "I told you not to look. I told you some things can't be unseen." The door didn't open. The footsteps walked away. Whitmore and Chen waited 5 full minutes in complete darkness before moving. When they finally emerged, the captain's quarters were empty. Burke was gone. They made it back to their bunks without being seen. Neither of them slept. They lay in the dark, holding onto the journal, trying to figure out what to do next. Every option seemed impossible. If they went to Burke, he might kill them to protect the officers. If they tried to leave the fort, they'd freeze in the wilderness. If they waited for the captain to return, he'd know his secret was exposed, and he'd have to eliminate them. As dawn broke, Whitmore realized there was only one choice. They had to tell the other guards. Not all of them, not the ones loyal to Burke or the captain, but the good ones, the ones who still believed in honor. If they could get enough guards on their side, they could arrest the officers when they returned, hold them for trial, bring this nightmare into the light. Chen agreed. They started carefully, feeling out which guards could be trusted. Private Anderson, who'd been at the fort for 2 years and always seemed troubled by something. Corporal Reeves, who'd argued with the captain about prisoner treatment. Young Private Foster, barely 18, who still had idealism in his eyes. One by one, they brought these men into the conspiracy, showed them the journal, watched their faces crumble as they read the dates and names of men they'd known, men who'd been murdered and consumed by the people they were supposed to trust. By the time the captain returned 3 days later, Whitmore and Chen had 8 guards ready to move. It wasn't many. The fort still had 20 guards total, plus Burke and the returning officers, but it would have to be enough. The plan was simple. Wait until night. Arrest the captain and officers while they slept. Secure the evidence. Send riders to the territorial capital with the journal and witness statements. Hold the fort until the authorities arrived, but they'd underestimated how quickly Burke would act. That evening, as the guards gathered for the dinner shift change, Burke called Whitmore and Chen to his office. When they arrived, they found the door barred from inside. Burke's voice came through the wood. "I know what you found. I know what you're planning. The captain knows too. He's willing to make you an offer." "What offer?" Chen demanded. "Join us. Eat with us. Survive the winter. When spring comes, we'll release the remaining prisoners. We'll bury the evidence. No one ever has to know what happened here. You'll get through this alive. All of you." "And if we refuse?" Whitmore asked. Burke was quiet for a long moment. "Then there are still 13 prisoners left. That's not enough meat to feed 30 guards plus officers for another 6 weeks until the thaw, but it's enough to feed the officers and the guards who make the right choice. The others, well, hunger does terrible things to men. You'll die slowly, weakly, or you can pick up your weapons now, try to fight, and die quickly. Your choice." Whitmore looked at Chen. The older man's jaw was set firm. He shook his head. They both knew what they had to do. This wasn't about survival anymore. This was about stopping something evil before it consumed everyone. They walked away from Burke's office, gathered the 8 loyal guards, told them what Burke had said. 2 of them, Anderson and Foster, broke down, said they couldn't do it, couldn't fight their commanding officers. Whitmore understood. He didn't blame them. That left 6 guards, including himself and Chen. 6 men against Burke, the captain, 4 officers, and at least 12 guards, who'd apparently decided survival mattered more than morality. The odds weren't good. But Whitmore remembered something his father had told him before he joined the military. Evil triumphs. When good men do nothing. He thought it was just something father said. Now, he understood it was the truest thing he'd ever heard. They armed themselves. Standard issue rifles, sidearms. Whatever ammunition they could gather quietly. They positioned themselves in the main hall, the central space of the fort, where they'd have sight lines in multiple directions. Then they waited. The captain came at midnight. He didn't come alone. He brought all his officers plus Burke and 15 guards. They spread out around the room, surrounding Whitmore's small group. The captain stepped forward, and Whitmore could see him clearly for the first time in weeks. The man looked healthy, well-fed, strong. While everyone else in the fort had been starving, the captain had been thriving on the flesh of the men he was supposed to protect. Captain Holbrook smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "Private Whitmore, Private Chen, I admire your principles. I truly do. But principles don't keep you alive in winter. Principles don't fill your belly when the supply wagons stop coming. Principles are a luxury for men who've never truly known hunger. You're a monster, Chen said. The captain's smile didn't waver. I'm a survivor, and I've ensured that everyone under my command has survived this winter. Can you say the same? How many of your fellow guards have died because you wouldn't make hard choices? Those weren't choices, Whitmore said. That was murder. You killed prisoners. You butchered them like animals. They were going to die anyway, the captain replied calmly. Malnutrition. Exposure. They were dead men. I just made their deaths serve a purpose, and now their sacrifices kept 43 men alive. 43 lives saved at the cost of 24 who were already lost. Tell me, Private, how is that not the moral choice? Because they were people, Whitmore said. His voice was shaking now, not with fear but with rage. They had names, families. They deserved better than to be someone's meal. They deserve to survive, the captain said. We all do. Lower your weapons. Join us. There's still time to make the right choice. Chen raised his rifle. His hands were steady now, all the shaking gone. He pointed it directly at the captain's chest. You want my answer? Here it is. The shot echoed through the stone halls like thunder, but Chen's bullet never reached the captain. One of Burke's guards had fired first, catching Chen in the shoulder. The older man spun and fell. Whitmore dove for cover as the room erupted in gunfire. What happened next was chaos. Bullets ricocheted off stone walls. Men screamed and fell. Whitmore found himself pressed behind an overturned table, firing blindly at shapes in the smoke and darkness. He heard Private Reeves cry out, saw Corporal Williams go down clutching his stomach. The noise was deafening, overwhelming, impossible to think through. Then, suddenly, it stopped. The shooting ceased. Whitmore risked a look over his barricade. 3 of his 6 guards were down. Chen was still alive, but bleeding badly. The captain's forces had taken casualties too, maybe 4 or 5 men, but they still had overwhelming numbers. Enough, the captain said. His voice cut through the silence like a blade. You've made your point, Private Whitmore. You have principles. You're willing to die for them. I respect that, but I'm not willing to lose any more men tonight. So here's what's going to happen. You and your remaining friends are going to put down your weapons. You're going to surrender. And we're going to lock you in the prisoner cells while we decide what to do with you. And then? Whitmore asked. He already knew the answer. And then we'll see how strong your principles are when you're the one starving in cells, when you're watching your friends waste away, when you realize that all you had to do was eat and you chose death instead. We'll see how long your moral superiority lasts. Whitmore looked at Chen. The older man nodded weakly. They'd lost this fight, but the journal was still hidden in Chen's coat. The evidence still existed. If they could stay alive long enough, if they could get word to someone outside the fort, maybe justice would still come. They lowered their weapons. The captain's men moved in, disarmed them roughly, dragged them toward the prisoner cells. As they passed the captain, Holbrook leaned close to Whitmore. You could have survived, he whispered. You chose this. No, Whitmore replied. You chose this. We're just the ones who have to stop you. They threw him into a cell. The door clanged shut. Through the bars, Whitmore could see Chen being dragged into the cell next to his. The older man was still conscious, still clutching his shoulder, where the bullet had entered. Their eyes met. Chen gave a small nod. He still had the journal. They still had hope. But as the guards walked away, as darkness settled over the cells, Whitmore understood just how slim that hope was. They were prisoners now, at the mercy of men who'd already proven they had no mercy left. Outside, the winter wind howled against the stone walls. Inside, Whitmore wrapped himself in the thin blanket they'd left him and tried to figure out how to survive long enough to see justice done. The next morning, the captain came to their cells. He looked disappointed. "I gave you a choice," he said. "You made the wrong one. Now you'll live with the consequences. Or more accurately, you'll die with them." He walked away. The guards brought no food, no water, just silence and cold, and the growing understanding that these cells, this forgotten corner of a forgotten fort, might be where their story ended. But Whitmore refused to accept that. Chen refused to accept it. Even bleeding, even weakening, they refused to give up, because somewhere out there, beyond these walls, beyond this winter, there were people who still believed in justice. People who would demand answers about what happened at Fort Resolution. People who would read the journal and understand the truth. All they had to do was survive long enough for those people to arrive. In the darkness of his cell, Whitmore closed his eyes and started counting days. Day 1 in the cells passed in silence. No guards came except to remove the bodies of the men who died in the gunfight. Whitmore watched them drag Reeves and Williams away. Good men, men who'd chosen principle over survival. He wondered if their bodies would end up on hooks in that frozen room. Chen was getting worse. Through the bars between their cells, Whitmore could see him shivering despite being wrapped in both blankets. The shoulder wound had stopped bleeding, but infection was setting in. Without treatment, Chen had maybe a week, maybe less in this cold. On day 2, the captain returned. He brought something with him. A plate of food, real food, meat and bread, and what looked like potatoes. The smell made Whitmore's stomach clench. He hadn't eaten in over 36 hours, and his last meal before rest had been thin gruel. The captain set the plate on the floor outside Whitmore's cell, just beyond his reach. "All you have to do is ask," he said. "Tell me you understand why I did what I did. Tell me you'd have made the same choice in my position. Do that, and this is yours." Whitmore stared at the plate. His mouth was watering. His hands were shaking. Every instinct screamed at him to agree, to say whatever the captain wanted to hear, to eat and survive. But he thought about the journal, about the 24 names written in that leather-bound book, about David Marsh praying in his cell. "I'd rather starve," he said. The captain picked up the plate and walked away. As he left, he called back over his shoulder, "We'll see how you feel in a few more days." That night, Whitmore heard screaming from the prisoner section, not the cells where he and his fellow guards were being held, but the area where the remaining 13 inmates were kept. The screams went on for hours. Then they stopped. In the morning, there were only 12 prisoners left. Chen was delirious by day 3. He kept calling out for his wife, for his children. Whitmore tried to talk to him through the bars, tried to keep him anchored to reality, but the fever had him. The older man rambled about home, about sunshine, about meals his mother used to cook. Sometimes he'd snap back to lucidity for a few minutes, remember where he was, what they'd discovered. Then, the fever would take him again. During one of these lucid moments, Chen managed to tell Whitmore something crucial. The journal wasn't just in his coat. He'd torn out the most important pages, the ones with the names and dates, and hidden them in the lining of his boot. Even if they took his coat, searched his body, they wouldn't find the evidence unless they had completely destroyed the boot. And they wouldn't do that. Boots were valuable in winter. Whitmore felt a surge of hope. The evidence would survive, even if they didn't. Someone would find it eventually. Someone would know the truth. Day 4 brought a new horror. The captain gathered all the remaining guards, both his loyalists and the prisoners, and made them watch as he selected another inmate for execution. The man begged, pleaded, promised he wouldn't tell anyone what was happening if they just let him live. The captain shot him in the head without hesitation. The body was dragged away to that frozen room. "This is what survival looks like," the captain told the assembled guards. "This is what it takes to live through winter when the world abandons you. Remember that." Some of the guards looked sick, but they didn't object, didn't protest. They just watched and were silent. Whitmore realized that most of them hadn't been actively evil when this started. They'd just been scared and hungry and weak. The captain had made the first terrible choice for them, and after that, each subsequent choice became easier. Now, they were so deep into complicity that turning back seemed impossible. By day 5, Whitmore was weak himself. No food, barely any water. The cold was seeping into his bones. He spent most of his time curled in a ball, trying to conserve heat and energy. Chen had stopped talking. The older man just lay on his cell floor, breathing shallowly, eyes closed. Whitmore wasn't sure if he was unconscious or just conserving strength. That evening, Sergeant Burke came to Whitmore's cell. The older man looked tired, worn down. He sat on the floor outside the bars and just stared at nothing for a long time. Finally, he spoke. "I want you to understand something, Private. I'm not a monster. I never wanted this. When the captain first suggested it back in November, I told him he was insane. I threatened to report him. But he showed me the supply numbers, showed me the weather reports, made me see that we weren't going to make it through winter. Not all of us. Some people were going to die. The only question was who. You could have sent riders for help," Whitmore said. His voice was hoarse from dehydration. "We did," Burke said quietly. "In early December. 3 men. Good riders. None of them made it back. We found 2 of them frozen to death a week later. The 3rd we never found at all. After that, the captain said we were on our own. Said we had to make hard choices. So you chose murder," Whitmore said. "We chose survival," Burke corrected, "and I stand by that choice. But I want you to know it wasn't easy. I think about those men every day, every night. I see their faces, but I also see the faces of the men who are still alive because of what we did. 40 guards and officers who would have starved without the captain's decision. 40 people who are now murderers and cannibals," Whitmore said. "That's what you saved. Their lives, maybe, but not their souls." Burke stood up. "You're young," he said. "You still think the world works on principles. Wait until you're my age. Wait until you've seen enough people die. Then tell me whether souls matter more than heartbeats." He walked away. Whitmore lay in the darkness, thinking about what Burke had said. Part of him understood the logic, the cold mathematics of survival, but understanding didn't mean accepting. There had to be lines you didn't cross. Had to be. Otherwise, what separated men from beasts? On day 6, something changed. Whitmore heard commotion outside the cells, raised voices. Someone was arguing with the captain. He pressed himself against the bars, trying to hear. The voices grew louder. Then a gunshot. Then silence. Hours later, Burke appeared again. His face was grim. "Private Foster tried to leave," he said. "Tried to take a horse and ride for help. The captain caught him. Made an example of him." "You killed a boy," Whitmore said. "He was 18 years old. He betrayed us," Burke said. "He would have brought authorities down on all of us." "He tried to do the right thing," Whitmore countered. "The thing you should have done months ago." Burke didn't respond to that. He just turned and left. But Whitmore saw something in the old sergeant's face that hadn't been there before. Doubt? Or maybe just exhaustion. Either way, cracks were forming in the captain's control. Day 7 brought delirium. Whitmore kept drifting in and out of consciousness. Sometimes he'd wake up convinced he was back home, that all of this had been a fever dream. Then reality would crash back. The cold, the hunger, the stone walls. Chen had stopped moving altogether. Whitmore called to him but got no response. That's when the voices started. Not real voices, hallucinations brought on by starvation and dehydration. Whitmore heard his mother singing lullabies, heard his commanding officer from basic training calling cadence, heard the prisoners who died calling his name from the frozen room. He knew they weren't real. Knew it was his mind breaking down from lack of food. But knowing didn't make them stop. The voices got louder, more insistent, demanding he respond. He curled tighter into himself and tried to focus on something real, something solid. The journal pages in Chen's boo. That was real. That mattered. On day 8, Anderson came to his cell. The guard who'd refused to fight, who'd chosen survival over principle. The young man looked broken, couldn't meet Whitmore's eyes. He slid a piece of bread through the bars, small, hard, probably days old, but food. "I'm sorry," Anderson whispered. "I should have stood with you. I should have been brave. But I was scared, and now I'm one of them, and I don't know how to live with what I've become." Whitmore wanted to eat the bread. His body screamed for it, but he looked at Anderson's face and understood that this wasn't kindness. This was guilt. Anderson needed Whitmore to forgive him, needed to see that someone could still be saved. He pushed the bread back through the bars. "Give it to Chen," he said. "He needs it more than I do." Anderson took the bread. Tears were running down his face now. "I don't know how to make this right," he said. "Then stop it," Whitmore said. "Help us. Get the journal to someone who matters. That's how you make it right." Anderson looked like he wanted to say something else, but footsteps approached, another guard making rounds. Anderson fled. The bread was gone. Whitmore lay back down and tried not to think about the taste he'd never have. The next morning, day 9, Whitmore woke to find Chen's cell empty. For a moment, panic seized him. They'd taken him, taken the journal. Everything was lost. But then he saw the boot, lying in the corner of Chen's cell. They'd taken the man but left his possessions. The journal pages were still safe. Hours later, Burke returned. His face was carefully neutral. "Private Chen died this morning," he said. "Infection took him. We're preparing his body now." "Preparing," Whitmore said flatly. "Like you prepared the others." Burke flinched, but didn't deny it. "The captain says you have until tomorrow to change your mind. After that, you'll join Chen. I've been ordered to tell you this is your last chance. Tell the captain I'll see him in hell," Whitmore said. Burke nodded slowly. "I expect you will," he said. "I expect we all will." That night was the longest of Whitmore's life. He knew tomorrow would bring death, knew the captain would make good on his threat. He'd failed. Failed to stop the murders. Failed to save Chen. Failed to bring justice. The only thing left was dying with some shred of dignity intact. But as darkness fell, completely, as Whitmore prepared himself for the end, he heard something. Something from outside the fort. Distant at first, then growing louder. The sound of horses, multiple horses, and voices calling out in military cadence. Relief had arrived. The spring thaw had come early. Supply wagons were here, and with them, if Whitmore's ears weren't deceiving him, was someone of significant rank. He could hear the guards scrambling, heard the captain shouting orders, heard panic in voices that had been confident for months. Whitmore pressed himself against the bars of his cell and called out with what little strength remained. "Help!" he shouted. "Prisoners here! Evidence of crimes! Help!" His voice was weak, barely carrying beyond his cell. But it was enough. Someone heard. Someone was coming. Footsteps approached his cell. Not Burke or the captain or any of the guards he recognized. A new face, an officer he'd never seen before. A major, based on the insignia. "What's going on here?" the major demanded. Whitmore tried to speak, tried to tell him everything, but his voice failed. The words wouldn't come. Months of horror compressed into a moment, and he couldn't make his mouth form the sounds. Frustration and weakness overwhelmed him. He was going to fail. Even now, with help finally here, he was going to fail. But then he remembered Chen's boot, the evidence. He pointed frantically to the next cell, to the corner where the boot lay. The major looked confused, but followed his gesture. One of the guards with him retrieved the boot. They examined it, found nothing, started to walk away. "No," Whitmore managed to croak out. "Inside, lining! Check the lining!" The major drew a knife and carefully cut into the boot's inner lining. Pages fell out, folded papers covered in handwriting. The major unfolded them and began to read. His face went from confusion to shock to rage in the span of seconds. "Get the captain," he ordered one of his men. "Get all the officers under arrest, now." Whitmore slumped against the bars. It was over. Finally, after 9 days of starvation and terror, after losing Chen and Reeves and Williams and Foster, after watching good men become complicit in evil, it was finally over. Justice was coming. The truth was known. The major unlocked his cell. "Are you the one who wrote this?" he asked, holding up the journal pages. "My friend Chen," Whitmore said. "Before they killed him, he documented everything." The major's jaw clenched. "We'll need your testimony. Your full account of what happened here. Can you do that?" Whitmore nodded. "Every word," he promised. "Every detail. They need to answer for what they did." But what Whitmore didn't know yet, what he couldn't have known in that moment of relief and exhaustion, was that justice wasn't going to be as simple as he hoped. The major who'd saved him was named Thomas Hartwell, and he was a political creature, a man who understood that scandals could destroy careers, that the military's reputation was worth more than truth. Over the next 3 days, as Whitmore recovered in the fort's medical bay, as food and warmth slowly brought him back from the edge of death, he started to notice strange things. The major was interviewing witnesses, yes, taking statements, collecting evidence, but he was also talking quietly with certain officers, meeting privately with Burke, and some of the guards who'd been most complicit in the captain's crimes were being released, told they could return to regular duty. Whitmore confronted Hartwell on the 4th day. "What's happening?" he demanded. "Why aren't all of them under arrest?" The major looked uncomfortable. "It's complicated, Private. There are considerations beyond simple guilt or innocence. The military's reputation, the families of the men involved, the political implications of a scandal this size." 24 men were murdered, Whitmore said, "butchered and eaten. What complication outweighs that?" Hartwell sighed. "Look around you, Private. This fort is in the middle of nowhere. The conditions here were impossible. Yes, terrible things happened. But if we prosecute everyone involved, we're talking about executing or imprisoning dozens of soldiers. We're talking about a public trial that would destroy faith in the military. Is that what you want?" "I want justice," Whitmore said. "Justice," Hartwell replied, slowly, "isn't always the same as revenge. Captain Holbrook will face court-martial. So will his immediate officers, the ones who actively participated in the killings. But the guards, who just looked the way, who were scared and weak but didn't actually kill anyone, they'll be discharged quietly, given the chance to go home and live with what they've done." "That's not enough," Whitmore protested. "It's what's going to happen," Hartwell said firmly. "You can testify, you can tell your story, but the scope of the prosecution is already decided. Accept it or don't, but it won't change." Whitmore felt something break inside him. He'd survived. He'd saved the evidence. He'd done everything right. And still, the system was going to protect itself. Still, most of the guilty would walk free. The victory he'd fought for was hollow. But he testified anyway, stood before the court-martial board and told them everything, described the frozen room with its hooks and its packages of human meat, recounted Chen's final days, bleeding and fevered while trying to preserve evidence, named every name he could remember, made them see the horror of what had happened. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Captain Richard Holbrook sat through it all with his face like stone, never showing remorse, never breaking down. When asked if he had anything to say in his defense, he stood and delivered a speech that Whitmore would never forget. "I did what was necessary," Holbrook said. "I was given command of a fort, that the military forgot, left to die with insufficient supplies and no support. When men started starving, I made a choice. Yes, it was a terrible choice. Yes, it violated every principle we claim to hold dear. But it kept 43 men alive, 43 soldiers who are breathing today because I had the courage to do what needed to be done. You can execute me if it makes you feel better. You can pretend that your hands are clean and mine are dirty. But we all know the truth. You abandoned us. You left us to freeze and starve. I just refused to die quietly. The court found him guilty anyway. Him and his 4 officers. Death by firing squad. Burke and the 12 guards, who had actively helped with the killings, got life sentences at hard labor. The rest were discharged, their service records marked with vague disciplinary issues, but nothing that would prevent them from finding civilian work. Whitmore watched the executions, felt he owed it to the victims to see it through. Holbrook died without flinching, without asking for mercy. His last words were simple: I'd do it again. Given the same circumstances, I'd make the same choice. And so would any of you. After the trial, the military moved quickly to bury the story. The official report was sealed. Newspapers were given a sanitized version that mentioned supply failures and disciplinary issues, but nothing about cannibalism. The fort itself was ordered demolished, every stone scattered, the site left to return to wilderness. Whitmore was offered a promotion, a transfer to a prestigious posting, money to keep quiet about the details that hadn't come out in trial. He refused all of it, took his discharge, and left the military without looking back. But leaving didn't mean escaping. The nightmares started immediately. Every night, Whitmore saw the frozen room, saw the packages hanging from hooks, saw Chen dying in the next cell while he was powerless to help, saw the faces of the 24 prisoners whose names he'd memorized from the journal. Sometimes they just stared at him. Sometimes they asked why he hadn't saved them. Sometimes they told him he should have died too, that survival was its own kind of guilt. He tried to build a normal life. Moved to a small town in Pennsylvania where nobody knew his history, found work as a clerk, kept his head down and his mouth shut. But the memories followed him. He couldn't eat meat without seeing human flesh, couldn't hear arguments without remembering the captain's justifications, couldn't sleep without the voices starting again. 5 years after Fort Resolution, Whitmore received a letter, no return address. Inside was a single page torn from a book. He recognized it immediately, one of the journal pages from Chen's boot, the page with David Marsh's name on it, the prisoner who'd prayed in his cell before being killed. Someone had saved it. Someone wanted him to remember. The letter came with a note. 3 words: they're still free. Whitmore investigated, found out that of the 12 guards sentenced to hard labor, 8 had been quietly released after serving less than 2 years. Political pressure, family connections, the military's desire to move past the scandal. Burke himself was still imprisoned, but rumors said he'd be eligible for parole soon. This was when Whitmore started writing, not for publication, not for anyone else, just for himself. A way to process what had happened, to make sense of how the system had failed so completely. He documented everything, not just the events at the fort, but the trial, the cover-up, the releases. He interviewed other survivors when he could find them, guards who'd left the military and were willing to talk privately. What he discovered made the original horror worse. Fort Resolution hadn't been unique. Other remote outposts had faced similar supply failures. Other commanders had made similar choices. The military knew, had known for years. They just didn't want the public to know. didn't want to admit that their logistics were so poor, their oversight so weak, that cannibalism had become a survival strategy in isolated posts. One former quartermaster told Whitmore that supply failures were considered acceptable losses, that the military operated on the assumption that a certain percentage of remote posts would be cut off each winter, and that commanders were expected to handle it. How they handled it was left deliberately vague. Plausible deniability, the quartermaster called it. Don't ask what they're eating if they're still alive in spring. This revelation destroyed something fundamental in Whitmore. He'd believed the captain was an aberration, a monster who'd made uniquely evil choices. But what if Holbrook was just the one who got caught? What if there were other frozen rooms and other forgotten forts? Other journals documenting other murders? Other Chens dying to preserve evidence that would never see daylight? He started drinking, not heavily at first, just enough to quiet the voices, enough to sleep without dreaming. But gradually, the amount needed increased. By his mid-30s, Whitmore was drinking himself through most days, using alcohol to create distance between himself and memories he couldn't escape. His only anchor was his journal. The detailed account of Fort Resolution that grew longer every year as he added new information, new connections, new evidence of the military's complicity. He told himself he was preserving the truth, that someday someone would read it and understand, that the victims would be remembered properly. But deep down, he knew he was just trying to make sense of senseless horror. 10 years after the trial, Whitmore received another letter. This one had a return address. Sergeant Thomas Burke, recently released from prison. Inside was an invitation to meet. Burke wanted to talk, wanted to explain himself, wanted, the letter said, to make amends. Whitmore almost burned the letter, almost pretended it had never arrived. But something made him keep it, made him respond, made him agree to meet Burke at a small restaurant in Ohio, halfway between where they both now lived. The man who walked into that restaurant looked nothing like the Sergeant Whitmore remembered. Burke was old now, worn down by prison and guilt. He moved slowly, carefully, like someone who'd learned that the world could break you if you weren't cautious. When he saw Whitmore, his face crumpled. "I'm sorry," Burke said immediately, before even sitting down, before any pleasantries, just raw, immediate apology. "I'm so sorry for what happened, for what I let happen, for what I did." Whitmore didn't respond, didn't know how to respond. He'd imagined this confrontation 1,000 times, but now that it was happening, all his prepared speeches evaporated. Burke sat down, ordered coffee but didn't drink it, just stared at the cup and talked. "I tell myself I had no choice," he said, "that the captain made the decisions and I just followed orders. But that's a lie. I had choices. Every day I had choices. I could have refused. Could have stopped him. Could have done what you did. But I was scared. Scared of dying. Scared of being responsible for other men dying. So I let the prisoners die instead. Convinced myself it was different because they were already condemned men. They weren't condemned to that," Whitmore said quietly. "No," Burke agreed. "They weren't. And I knew it was wrong. Knew it every time we selected another one. Every time I helped prepare the meat. Every time I ate. I knew. But I kept doing it anyway because stopping would have meant facing what I'd become. And I wasn't brave enough for that." He looked up at Whitmore. "You were brave enough. You and Chen and the others who stood up. You chose death over compromise. And you survived anyway. Got to live with your principles intact. Meanwhile, I survived by abandoning everything I believed in. And I've spent every day since wishing I'd died in that fort instead." Whitmore felt no satisfaction in hearing this. No sense of vindication. Just emptiness. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "I don't know," Burke admitted. "Forgiveness, maybe. Though I don't deserve it." or maybe just witness. Someone to acknowledge that I know what I did was evil, that I'm not hiding from it anymore. I can't forgive you, Whitmore said. That's not my place. The men you killed, they're the ones who could forgive, and they're gone. Burke nodded. I know. But I needed to try. Needed you to know that some of us do remember. Some of us do feel the weight of what happened. The meeting lasted another hour. Burke told Whitmore about life in prison, about the other guards who'd served time with him, how some had found religion, some had gone mad, some had killed themselves, how he'd tried to make peace with what he'd done but never quite managed it, how release from prison had just meant transferring to a different kind of cell, one built for memory and regret. When they parted, Burke handed Whitmore an envelope. Inside was money, a lot of money. Every cent I've saved since release, Burke explained. I want you to do something with it. Build a memorial, start a fund for the families, something. I can't make it right, but maybe this helps in some small way. Whitmore took the money, used it exactly as Burke suggested, found the families of the 24 murdered prisoners, and distributed the funds among them. Most had never known exactly what happened to their relatives. The military had told them vague stories about deaths from disease or exposure. Whitmore told them the truth, gave them closure, even though the closure was horrific. Some families were grateful, others were devastated. A few wanted nothing to do with him, blamed him for surviving when their loved ones hadn't. He understood. Guilt wasn't logical, grief even less so. He carried their anger alongside his own and tried to bear it with grace. The memorial took longer. He worked with a small town in Pennsylvania, near where the fort had stood, convinced them to allow a simple stone marker. No elaborate monument, no dramatic statues, just a plain granite block with 24 names carved into it. Above the names, a single sentence. They deserved better than this. Below the names, a date, winter 1888 to 1889. The dedication ceremony was small, a few family members, a local priest, Whitmore himself, no military presence, no official recognition, just quiet acknowledgement of lives that had been taken and forgotten. Whitmore read each name aloud, tried to say something about each man beyond how they died. David Marsh, who'd loved music. Thomas Williams, who'd been studying to be a teacher. Henry Johnson, who'd written poetry. Made them human again, not just victims. After the ceremony, an elderly woman approached him. She was the mother of one of the prisoners, a young man named Peter Sullivan, who'd been killed in early December. She thanked Whitmore for remembering her son, for making sure he wasn't just erased from history. Then she said something that Whitmore would think about for the rest of his life. My son made a mistake, she said. Deserted his post because he was scared. But he didn't deserve what happened to him. Nobody deserves that. What you did, standing up when everyone else stayed quiet, that matters. Not because it changed what happened. It didn't. Peter still died. But because it proved that someone cared. That someone thought his life was worth risking everything for. Thank you for being that someone. Whitmore broke down, right there at the memorial. All the years of holding himself together, of carrying the weight alone, of trying to make sense of the senseless. It all came pouring out. He wept for Chen and the other guards who died fighting. He wept for the 24 prisoners whose names were now carved in stone. He wept for himself and the innocents he'd lost. He wept for Burke and the other guards who had to live with what they'd become. He wept for a system that had allowed it all to happen and then worked to forget. Peter Sullivan's mother held him while he cried. This stranger who'd lost her son to horror, comforting the man who'd survived it. When Whitmore finally composed himself, she smiled sadly. "You carry too much," she said. "You didn't kill those men. You tried to save them. The weight isn't yours to bear alone." But Whitmore did bear it, continued bearing it through the decades that followed. He married eventually, though he never told his wife the full story. Had children who grew up thinking their father had simply been a clerk who happened to serve briefly in the military. Lived a quiet, unremarkable life. On the surface, while underneath, the memories churned and festered and refused to fade. The journal grew thicker, hundreds of pages documenting everything. The events at the fort, the trial, the cover-up, the aftermath, his meetings with families, his own struggles with what he'd witnessed. He wrote it all down compulsively, as if documenting it could somehow make sense of it, could extract meaning from meaningless horror. In his 60s, Whitmore started showing symptoms of what doctors today would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Back then, they just called it nervous exhaustion. The nightmares intensified. He started having panic attacks in crowded spaces, couldn't stand the smell of cooking meat. Would wake up convinced he was back in the cell at Fort Resolution, starving and waiting for death. His wife found the journal during one of these episodes, read enough to understand what her husband had been carrying all these years. She didn't leave him, didn't judge him, just held him and told him she understood why he'd never spoken about it. "Some things," she said, "are too heavy to share, but you don't have to carry them alone anymore." With her support, Whitmore started the slow process of healing. Not forgetting, never forgetting, but learning to live with the memories without letting them consume him. He started speaking to other veterans, men who'd experienced their own horrors in different wars, different situations, found community in shared trauma, discovered that while his specific experience was unique, the fundamental damage of witnessing atrocity was universal. One of these veterans, a man named Samuel Cross, who had fought in the Civil War, told Whitmore something that shifted his perspective. "You think your survival means something was wrong?" Cross said. "Like you should have died with the others or your life isn't valid. But survival isn't guilt. It's responsibility. You're alive to tell the story, or to make sure they're remembered. That's not a burden. It's a purpose." Whitmore started to see it that way, started to understand that his decades of documentation, his memorial, his talks with families, they weren't just guilt management. They were fulfillment of the promise he'd made in that cell. Every word, he told Major Hartwell, every detail, they need to answer for what they did. He'd kept that promise. And even though justice had been incomplete, even though most of the guilty had escaped real punishment, he'd ensured that the truth survived. In his final years, Whitmore made arrangements for his journal to be preserved, donated it to a military archive with instructions that it be sealed until 50 years after his death. Long enough that anyone implicated would be gone. Long enough that historical truth could matter more than political embarrassment. The archive accepted, understanding the value of first-hand accounts, even when they revealed uncomfortable realities. Whitmore died in 1936 at age 72. His death certificate listed heart failure as the cause, but those who knew him understood it was really the accumulated weight of memory that finally stopped his heart. He was buried near the memorial he'd built, close to the names of the men he'd tried to save. His journal was unsealed in 1986. Historians who read it were shocked at the level of detail, the emotional honesty, the unflinching account of both horror and human weakness. It became a primary source for understanding military life in remote posts during the late 19th century, sparked new research into how soldiers coped with isolation and deprivation, led to reforms in how the military handled logistics and oversight of distant installations, but more importantly, it gave names and stories back to the 24 prisoners who died at Fort Resolution. Made them more than statistics, more than footnotes, in a scandal the military had tried to erase. Each entry about each man, their personalities and hopes and final moments, it humanized them in a way official records never could. Researchers also discovered something else in the journal, evidence that Whitmore had suspected but never been able to prove. Fort Resolution wasn't the only place where this had happened. References in supply logs, gaps in personnel records, other remote posts with suspiciously high death rates during harsh winters. The pattern was there for anyone willing to look. A military historian named Dr. Elizabeth Chen, no relation to Private Marcus Chen, did look. Spent 15 years investigating every remote military outpost that operated between 1860 and 1900, cross-referenced supply records with death rates, interviewed descendants of soldiers who'd served in those posts, uncovered sealed reports and forgotten testimonies. What she found confirmed Whitmore's worst suspicions. At least 12 other posts had experienced similar situations. Maybe not as extreme as Fort Resolution, maybe not as well documented, but cannibalism as a survival strategy had occurred multiple times in isolated military facilities during winter supply failures. And in every case, the military had worked to suppress the information, had sealed the records, had quietly discharged or relocated anyone who might talk. Dr. Chen published her findings in 2003. The book, titled The Forgotten Horrors: Cannibalism in 19th Century Military Outposts, caused immediate controversy. The military initially denied everything. Then, when the evidence proved overwhelming, shifted to claiming these were isolated incidents by rogue commanders. Chen pushed back, pointing out that isolation and rogues weren't the problem. The problem was systematic neglect. Posts deliberately cut off with insufficient supplies. Commanders left to make impossible choices. A culture that valued secrecy over accountability. The book sparked debates that continue today about military responsibility, about the limits of survival ethics, about when, if ever, breaking fundamental moral rules becomes acceptable. Some argued that the commanders like Captain Holbrook had done what was necessary, that judging them from comfortable modern perspectives was unfair. Others insisted that some lines must never be crossed, that humanity mattered more than survival. Whitmore's journal became central to these debates. His eyewitness account, his moral clarity, his refusal to accept that necessity justified atrocity. He became a symbol of ethical courage, of standing against wrong even when the cost was enormous. Universities used his story in ethics classes. Military academies studied it as a case study in leadership failures. His name, forgotten for decades, entered public consciousness again. But the real impact wasn't in academic debates or military reforms. It was in the families. Descendants of the 24 prisoners who died at Fort Resolution finally learned what had happened to their ancestors, finally had names and dates and circumstances instead of vague official lies, finally could grieve properly. They gathered at the memorial Whitmore had built. More than 100 people, great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren of men who died in 1889. They held a ceremony, read names, shared stories passed down through generations, thanked James Whitmore, long dead, for ensuring their relatives weren't forgotten. One woman, a descendant of David Marsh, read from a letter her great-great-grandfather had written before enlisting. In it, he talked about wanting to serve with honor, about believing in something larger than himself, about how military service was a way to prove his worth. She cried as she read it, thinking about how that idealistic young man had ended his life praying in a cell before being murdered and consumed. But she also talked about Whitmore, about how he'd fought to remember Marsh, not as a victim, but as a person, how he'd documented that Marsh loved music, that he'd been kind to newer prisoners, that even in his final days, he'd tried to maintain dignity. These details, preserved in the journal, kept Marsh human, kept him from being reduced to just another name on a list of atrocities. That's the real legacy of Fort Resolution. Not the horror, though the horror was real. Not the cannibalism, though that happened. Not even the courage of men, like Whitmore and Chen, who stood against it. The legacy is simpler than all of that. It's the truth. The documented, preserved, undeniable truth that couldn't be buried no matter how hard the military tried.